Larry, let's start with what Shoigu said, that he says Russian tactical nuclear weapon drills are an appropriate response to Kiev's permission to attack Russian civilian facilities with missiles. And right now, with what has happened in Europe, what we're seeing in the United States, what the Russians are saying, how do you find the current situation of the conflict?
I think we're at a dangerous period, as dangerous as it's been all along, and getting more dangerous every day. That's what concerns me. And I was on a webinar today for about an hour with the Quincy Institute and several of their experts on the elections, the EU elections. And it's quite clear that most Europeans probably don't really care that much about the European Union and the elections, so they don't vote. But those that did vote wreaked a little bit of havoc. The big losers were Germany and France. Hard to connect that with Ukraine, but a couple of these people on the webinar said, yes, there's probably some thoughts about that, because there are people who are growing tired of this conflict, especially those who are next door to it. And the showing of Germany was abysmal. We now have 3, 4, 5, if you count Hungary, rather, let's just say, rightist parties. And I'm including a wide array in that: Meloni's Italian party and Marie Le Pen's party in France, and Alternative for Germany party. But 4 or 5, 4, I guess, scored the highest, and the 5th, Germany, scored second. So this is probably a development. Well, let's take Macron's reaction now. I think he was too clever. I think he may wind up paving the road for Le Pen, maybe not her personally, but her representative, to come into the presidency of France. And that's going to change a lot of things that aren't on the periphery necessarily, like most Europeans like to look at Brussels, but are serious. When it starts to ask Georgia to become a member, or other countries like that to become members, and it starts falling apart inside itself, you're in trouble. When Rishi Sunak has to offer a deal to kind of nullify Brexit, or at least some of its effects, and come back in and lead Europe's security identity, you're in trouble. I mean, Sunak might not last through the next election either. Probably won't. That's a long way to getting to. Things are changing around Ukraine that are making the situation, I think, in Ukraine even more dangerous. Not just what you just quoted the Russians as saying. And by the way, I think that is probably just Putin telling his people to go out and say things, like he does with Medvedev sometimes when he really wants crazy things said. And I don't think they're serious about using nuclear weapons unless we make them serious. And we can make them serious by, as Putin has said so clearly, existentially threatening Russia. In fact, I would widen that writ and say the Collective Security Treaty Organization, existential threat to that, and we will use nuclear weapons. I don't doubt that for a second. I don't doubt it for a moment. And doing stupid things like we did, allowing the Ukrainians, and there's no doubt in my mind that we knew about it, to shoot that early warning radar, which is simply a radar for detecting ballistic missiles over the horizon, has no impact on the Ukrainian battlefield at all, can't even surveil the Ukrainian battlefield, was utterly stupid to do that sort of thing. I mean, I can remember times when we exercised scenarios during the Cold War when that was a reason to launch. If you had your distant early warning radar attack, we called it the DEW line. If you had it attacked before we had all the array up in the skies and everything, if you had it attacked, that was reason to launch. It was called launch on warning. And you knew you only had from 28 to 32 minutes to launch. And then you were going to be dead. So it was mutual suicide, if you will. But nonetheless, that was sort of the reign of terror, mutually assured destruction, we called it. MAD, great acronym. And that was just stupid to shoot one of those eyes that Russia keeps trained on us to ensure that we don't unleash our nuclear weapons on them.
Yeah. Larry, you mentioned something so important about Medvedev and the way he's talking about the issue. Whenever we talk about Putin, it seems that we assume that Putin is in line with hardliners in Russia, but he's not. He's right in the middle, and
No,
he's
he's
trying.
pragmatic. He's
Yeah,
very pragmatic. And I used to use the term to describe H.W. Bush, prudent, prudent. And by the way, H.W. Bush loved that word. A prudent state, a prudent diplomacy, a prudent security policy. Those are the kinds of things. Prudent's a good word. We don't understand that word. But Putin is prudent,
yeah.
and pragmatic.
The Prime Minister of Belgium, who had promised Zelensky F-16s, lost the election, and he's stepping down. It seems that the situation of Ukraine and what has happened to Germany during this conflict has hit Europe the way that we have to study, we have to see what's going on in Europe, because they're dealing with inflation, they're dealing with this influx of immigrants coming. Every time we have a major war like in Syria, right now in Ukraine, Europe is the first place to get involved with these immigrants. And right now, they're feeling the same way that they have been feeling all those years. Right now, it's at their border with Ukraine. A lot of people coming in, and that's why the people, when we talk about what is happening right now in Europe, we say the right wing is winning in Europe, but it's not the story is not what is happening right now. I think people are so unhappy with the current policies in Europe. That's why they're trying to find an alternative.
And if you'll examine the campaign data, information, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, from each of the parties, while it's different, there is a common theme that people like Meloni and Marie Le Pen and others are recognizing what you just said in their own ways, in their own nations, in their own states. And they're sort of mending their policies to go along with and attract that kind of person, much the way I would say Trump did in the first term. And so you're finding people going away from the standard parties. I think the assessment of Wolfgang today on the webinar was that the German party now in charge of Germany probably has 29%. 29%. I thought it was lower than that, but he said 29. And when you look at some of the other percentages, they're pretty rock bottom in terms of liberal democracies and how their current governments are faring not very well. So we're going to have a lot of changes in these countries. And we just had a fairly substantial change in the EU, although I agree with them that's, most Europeans don't look at the EU as anything but a talking shop or something they throw rocks at when agricultural policy bothers them or whatever. But it is indicative of the political temper. And the people that we're supporting and the people who are supporting us in Ukraine didn't come out looking well in these elections. So that's got to have some repercussions for their own national entities and what happens to them there. I found out today, for example, I didn't know it was this high. There are 1 million plus Ukrainian refugees in Germany, 1 million plus. And then they talked about the mystery of the Netherlands suddenly turning against all of its past policies with regard to immigrants and immigration and becoming the bad man of Europe. And, this can happen overnight. It can just happen. We talked about the yellow vests in Paris and what that had meant. And could that come back? Of course it could. And could it spread? Yes, of course it could. The French have their own problems, of course, but a lot of those problems have common reasons that permeate much of the EU. So it's a dangerous time, and it's a particularly apt time to have a peace, to have a ceasefire and a peace agreement in Ukraine. Stupid wars that in most instances and for most people who are rational know we had a big hand in starting, we being the West, but particularly Washington and London.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think
and now we have, of course, you probably have this in your questions. We have this frigate and submarine steaming towards Cuba, and people say, "Well, this is normal. This is the propaganda we're putting out. This is normal. This is what the Russians do every year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever they do their exercise and so forth." Well, the frigate, Admiral Gorshkov, has Zircon missiles on it. Zircon missiles will go 7, 8, 9 times the speed of sound. Do the math there. That's almost 9,000 miles an hour. And they will go 1,000 miles. Is this normal? Well, yeah, it's normal. Right. Okay. What was their first event? Apparently, I was just reading about it. Their first event was firing one 600 miles on a supposed ship. And I know from talking with the Cuban foreign minister, I know from talking with the Cuban ambassador here in the United States, had dinner with him not too long ago. And I know from listening to the Cuban president, all three men, very articulate, even eloquent Cubans. And the two most powerful, the Cuban ambassador sort of said this in my ear. I was sitting next to him at the dinner table at his residence. Fulton Armstrong was there, and Bill Brennan and Bill Leo Grande, who are American University experts on Latin America. But he's sitting here and he's telling me, you know, you're going to make us into another Haiti. And what did the president and foreign minister say about a week later? You're going to, Biden, make us into another Haiti. Do you want that? Good question. Well, and by the way, the CIA was down in Santiago de Cuba, where there were genuine protests going on. I don't blame the Cubans for protesting. They got no food, they got no water, they got no electricity. The ones who aren't in the top 5%. Interesting division there that the ambassador was telling me about. What's happened is the remittances coming from Florida and the businesses that got started based on those remittances, which have become quite good because the Cubans are terrific entrepreneurs. That group, about 5 to 7%, is making money and eating well and has air conditioning, all this kind of stuff. But the rest of the Cubans are really hurting, really hurting. So this is really making it divisive in Cuba. So what do? We send into these genuine protests in Santiago de Cuba, we send in CIA to make them even worse. So I don't blame the president and foreign minister for asking Biden that question. Well, here come the Russians. What if we put some HIMARS missiles, or not HIMARS, but high speed zircons, whatever, in Cuba? They don't have nuclear warheads, but they will go fast and they will go far and they will hit the United States. What do you think about that, Mr. Biden? If I were the Cuban president, I would not hesitate for a second. Look what we've done with Ukraine. And look at what we're doing with some of the missiles that we and the EU and others are providing to Zelensky. Tit for tat. I think I'll come to Cuba and put a few missiles in. Oh, we've been there before, haven't we? October 1962. Difference today is we are much weaker, much weaker. The only still resonant strength we have is 5,000 plus nuclear warheads. This is getting worse every day.
Talking about the situation in the European Union, I think two leaders in Europe can explain what is happening in Europe right now. We have Orban, he's a right wing, and Fico, he's a left wing. Both of them are so popular in Europe. It shows that the people are not ideological. I'm not talking about the left wing or right wing. They're just considering the leaders who are serving their interests in European Union.
Exactly.
And the same way is happening right now. It seems the news, the French media is talking about Macron is considering the possibility of his resignation. These people, it seems to me that they have lost their connection with the reality of what's going on in their countries. They want to blame everything on Russia and what's going on in Ukraine in order to deal with the problems that they're having in their
It
countries.
deflects the attention from them. You know, first thing you do when you're in political trouble in your own country is you seek ways to deflect attention away from yourself. And the best way to do that, the most effective way to do that, is with something like a war, or like, you know, that costs people to have to think and to have to take notice and to have to listen to you. It isn't going to work, I don't think, because just what you said, all politics is local. And you can have a leftist leader and a rightist leader, and the leftist leader's in charge and bringing no surcease, no relief to the people. They're going to go over here, and vice versa if the situation is switched. They don't care what the credentials of the leader is. They care who delivers. And that's just the reality of politics. Macron is too clever by half. He's going to wind up unseating himself, whether it's voluntary or not. I think he thinks if it's voluntary, he'll then be able to turn to the right and say, okay, do your thing, and they'll fall on their face. Well, I don't think Le Pen's that stupid.
Larry, how do you see this situation? There are some rumors that they want to use the bases in the European Union to attack Russia. That would make these bases a legitimate target for Russia.
Absolutely.
And the other point would be the Article 5. What would happen to the Article 5 if that happens? It's so dangerous right now.
This has been my point since I listened into the conversation between, I think it was Henry Kissinger, it might have been George Kennan. They both said essentially the same thing. The worst mistake America had made since 2000, besides the invasion of Iraq, was the expansion of NATO. And my comment later to Powell was, I agree with him 100%. And we're going to find that out, and we're going to find it out real quickly. Article 5, I said, yeah, I've told this story to thousands of audiences across the United States. Go up to that farmer in West Texas and tell him that he's promised to use his nuclear weapons in defense of Montenegro. And the first thing he's going to say is, where the hell is Montenegro? You know, that you just don't have an American understanding of what we've done with this expansion of NATO. 32 countries now guaranteed that we will use nuclear weapons in their defense. That's what Article 5 means when you boil it down to its basic parameter, is everyone is under our nuclear umbrella. Well, there's only one other nuclear threat in that region, and it's as armed to the teeth as we are, and it's called Russia, and it's at war. We had a rule during the Cold War. I probably told you about this. Stop me if I'm repeating. Say, we had a rule during the Cold War. No nuclear weapon owning state would ever get itself into a war with another nuclear weapon owning state. That was a principle, absolute principle. We took that to India and Pakistan, and we pounded it into Delhi and Islamabad's head several times. They didn't listen too well, and they almost had an exchange back in 2002, as I recall. But that was a first principle of nuclear weapons. Well, look at what we're doing. We're getting closer and closer to having a war between two nuclear weapon owning states, Washington and Russia. This is crazy. It's crazy. And the closer we get, the more dangerous it gets, because it becomes very difficult to calculate the next step, the next move, the next escalation, if you will, and to be careful that you don't exceed that. And right now, the most dangerous capital in the world, without any doubt, is Washington. Washington, because we are not competently led. And I'm not even sure that this president is in possession of his mental faculties sufficiently to where he could make a decision that was sound, reasonable, practical, and not devastating. And that's a sad thing for a citizen to have to say, but that's where we are.
I don't know if you saw this video of Biden at the D-Day when he turned around, just looking the other way, and everybody, instead of warning him, everybody was turning the way he was looking at.
Well, see, I have empathy and sympathy and knowledge. I'll be 80 in 5 months, and I am dizzy. When I get up out of the bed in the morning, I'm dizzy. When I walk, I'm dizzy. I work out, I do exercise and such. I try to combat it, but I am old, and you should just write it down in the book of first principles. Do not ever have a president who is 80 years old. And we're looking at one who's going to be 83 or 84. Yeah, this is, and what's the alternative? 340 million people in this country, and we cannot find anyone better than Joseph Biden and Donald Trump. That is just an admission that we are the exceptional nation. No question, we are. No other nation would let itself arrive at that point.
Larry, Lindsey Graham is saying that the United States cannot allow Russia to win because there are many minerals in Ukraine that Russia would sell to China. You know, it's unbelievable how these people can just connect these dots together. In your opinion, at this particular moment, why he's arguing this way?
Because first, Lindsey Graham has no sheet that he can go to and look at and feel that anything written on that sheet that he is then going to speak indicates any mental competence on his part. I mean, his staff and the people who work for him are as stupid as he is. That's the honest to God truth. So when Lindsey Graham makes all these statements, and he makes all these crazy statements like the one about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when he makes the more callous ones, that's something somebody's written for him. I mean, him and John McCain were the same way. John McCain was a friend of Lindsey Graham's. I'm sure John McCain had come back from the grave and, haunt Lindsey Graham today. But John McCain was pretty much the same way. In fact, sometimes he would turn around, he would realize what he'd said and turn around and look at the person who'd written it for him and want to kill him or her because that's what we're in today with our senators in particular, but also with our representatives. Less so with them because they come and go so fast, they don't have the kind of trust often in their staff that the senators have to have. But you get Senator Murray, for example, the head of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, one of the most powerful positions in America. And she gets up and lies. She gets up and lies about the Snake River dams out in the Pacific Northwest, which are killing the salmon and killing the Southern Sea orca whales, just killing them, wiping them out. She gets up and lies. Well, does Patty know she's lying? I don't know. I'd like to think she doesn't. She's reading what her staff has given her. And that's what Lindsey does. And that's one reason Lindsey bounces all over the place, because one day he goes to this staffer, the next day to this staffer. And he doesn't have an original thought in his head. And when something does creep out, Lindsey, shut up. You can see his holders, they want to rein him in and pull him back. When he goes on TV, he's terrible because he can't be held back the way he is in other places. I remember when Strom Thurmond was getting ancient, and Lindsey's so fat now, I'm not so sure that he can even motivate himself down the halls in the Congress. I've never seen anybody go from being who he was when I knew him as a young man and who he is now. I mean, he looks like who was the guy in Star Wars? Jabba the Hutt, But that affects your ability to think too. He's not in good shape. He's not in good physical fitness. I would say that he's younger than I, and I'm probably more alert and astute than he is. So we got these people Patty Murray, Lindsey Graham's, Chuck Schumer's, Nancy Pelosi from the past. We got all these people that we keep around far too long, and they read scripts. That's all they do is read scripts and pick up the telephone and beg billionaires for money. That's all they do. We don't have any governing anymore. We don't have any people who are interested in the republic. We don't have any people who are interested in how faithful they are to the Constitution or to what the American people want or what the people even elected them to do. They're not. They're raising money and they're reading scripts. That's the life of a senator and a representative.
Sergei Lavrov says that if the United States arms Russia's enemy, they will receive a symmetrical response. What would mean, in your opinion, what would mean a symmetrical response? What they're talking about? They're talking about Syria, they're talking about Houthis, they're talking about Africa. What comes to your mind when they're talking about it?
It could be any one of those places. They certainly have the capacity in Africa to do it. I read, and probably rightfully, some speculation recently by some old retired intel people that they were going to push the French out of Niger and take over the uranium mines there. That would give them in China a real boost in terms of building out further their nuclear weapons complex. And they could do anything they wanted to, probably in the Sahel too. I mean, we're being kicked out left and right. And you mentioned the Houthis in the Red Sea. That's ripe for doing something, especially giving them more. Let's say they gave them some zircons, and we hit a carrier with a couple of them. What exactly would we do? I mean, here you've got Ike. She's overextended. Her sailors haven't been home in months. And all of a sudden, she's burning and maybe sinking. What are you going to do if you're Joe Biden? There, you've got another opportunity for escalation in a major way. Because what does Joe Biden do? Does he go pick another ship that belongs to the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, for example, and maybe try to sink it? Does he escalate from that point? But that is a possibility. And we just talked about one, put some of these missiles in Cuba. I don't think you'd be able to get Mexico to accept it. You probably, especially with the new president, and you probably wouldn't be able to get any other Latin American country to go along with that. They'd be too afraid of the hegemon in North America, which is truly us. But Cuba would. They do it reluctantly. The whole time I was down there, almost 10 years, working for President Obama in the middle part of that to get a rapprochement with Cuba. But the whole time I was down there, I didn't matter whether it was a hardcore communist or a more market-oriented economist. And there were many of them. Many economists in Cuba were being trained at the University of Havana and elsewhere to think about economy. And they were market people. They were free market people. And they wanted eagerly to get into the government, to get into the system, and to be effective. And you watch people like Raul Castro, for example, and you watch people like Fernando Ramirez, I think it was, a couple of others. They wanted that to happen. And we stopped it with our draconian sanctions and everything because we wouldn't let them break out. We wouldn't let them get out of their cast iron suits. So if you talk to these people, didn't matter where they were on that spectrum, they didn't like the Soviets. They didn't like the Soviets at all. So it would be with some reluctance that the Cubans asked the Russians to come back, particularly to allow them to come back with arms. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
So asymmetric response could be any number of things.
The other thing that is so important right now is the position of Turkey that is changing. And little by little, they wanted to be part of the European Union since 1999, and right now they're asking to be part of BRICS. And at the same time, you see just recently Turkish foreign minister held talks with Shoigu in Moscow. Nothing came out what was happening in this meeting. And How do you see, earlier we had Turkey just stating if NATO wants to fight Russia, they're not going to be part of this operation. These are huge statements on the part of Turkish government, that this shows how NATO is in trouble from within. And we have other nations in the European Union, they're not happy with fighting Russia. And right now Turkey is just changing. This movement is a drastic movement toward the east. How do you see the situation of NATO today? And how do you evaluate the behavior of Turkey?
Well, first, let's take Erdogan and Turkey. I think some of Erdogan's moves are aimed at his now somewhat precarious political position. He's trying to regain some of the solidity he had before. But if he's doing that the way you just described it, that means a lot of the Turkish people, he must think, believe that, that they're sick and tired of making overtures to the European Union and being rebuffed and rebuffed and rebuffed and rebuffed. So let's go look elsewhere. So if he thinks that's a vibrant political signal to send to the electorate in Turkey, then it must be. So that tells you that maybe the majority of the Turkish people are sick and tired of NATO. If they're sick and tired of NATO, Erdogan is going to sense that, and Erdogan is going to act on that for political reasons, as well as, I think, real security reasons. It's clear, I think, to at least, let's say there's 8 billion people in the world right now. It's clear to at least 50+% of those people that the power of the empire is on the wane. That's American power is on the wane. Talked to a German the other day who's really frightened that within the next 3 years, we're going to pull completely out of NATO and come home and say, bye, deal with whatever you need to deal with. We're not with you anymore. That is a possibility. He was positing it on the election of Trump, but it's a possibility without even the election of Trump, and it would happen pretty quick, I think, and pretty brutally. So Turkey leaves, takes the most powerful land army out of NATO, unanchors the southern flank, which is a very vulnerable flank if you think about it, and is gone somewhere. Neutrality and or realignment with the BRICS, or maybe even realignment more dramatically with Moscow and Beijing, and stated as such. NATO falls apart within 24 months.
Do you think in Washington, do they really recognize what's going on right now within NATO, or they really think that NATO is stronger and more powerful than ever?
Well, General Stoltenberg keeps telling him that it is. And I don't mean general as in secretary general. I mean general with 4 stars on his, he keeps telling them that everything is copacetic. Meanwhile, I'm hearing in Brussels, it isn't copacetic at all, that there are a lot of arguments amongst the flag officers. And I always listen to the rank right below the flag officers. It's a colonel or a colonel equivalent, or a Navy captain or equivalent in the other countries' armies and navies and Marine Corps. And there's a lot of dissension over whether or not the European policy vis-a-vis Ukraine is just a lapdog to Washington and to a certain extent to Britain, but Britain's a lapdog to Washington par excellence. And so why are we doing this? Why are we letting the Americans lead us down a primrose path? And then you've got a group that says they're going to lead us down the primrose path and then they're going to desert us. They're going to desert us, and we're going to be here holding the bag with a very angry Russia and a nasty Russia. What do we do then? Do we, call a meeting and say, okay, let's meet in Geneva and let's get this thing over with tomorrow morning? And then Putin's going to, he's going to do what he can to take the most he can possibly take out of that, probably, which isn't going to be that beneficial for what's left of Ukraine, or that matter, Europe. I don't believe this business of whetting Putin's appetite so that he would then try to eat more. I don't think that's his purpose at all. I think his purpose is exactly as he stated it: the security of Russia. And if we can't see that what we were doing in Georgia, in Ukraine, and really in a couple of other places too, is threatening to Russia, then we're the dumbest people on the face of the earth. I think we see it. I think we've seen it all along, and we want to do it. That's the idiocy of it.
Putin just reported in the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, he was talking about the casualties on the part of Ukrainian. He mentioned that they're suffering 50,000 soldiers per month. And if just we assume half of that, it's so much for Ukrainians.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable what's happening right now in Ukraine.
You
We
understand,
had earlier
understand why,
reports. Yeah.
you understand why soldiers are going over to the other side. Especially if the megaphone says, you know, we'll feed you, we'll clothe you, we'll take care of you, you won't die with a bullet through your chest, you know, we'll take care of you. And when we get a peace agreement, we'll repatriate you or whatever. If I were a Ukrainian 18, 19-year-old and my prospect was living another 24 hours maybe, and someone told me that, I might get out of the foxhole and go over there too.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, we know that at the same time, he's talking about he's ready to negotiate with the United States.
Yes.
Considering the current conditions in Ukraine, I think the current conditions are changing and changing drastically if the Biden administration doesn't recognize these new changes that are happening, that Ukraine will lose and lose more.
Absolutely. What will it take? Will it take one of Putin's generals knocking on Kyiv's front door to make them understand that it's lost? Or, very worrisome, as it looks like we might get to that situation, do we escalate big time and get met with the escalation you and I have been discussing, you know, nuclear weapons?
Yeah. Talking about the Middle East, the United States foreign policy in the Middle East, we've learned that the United States is offering Saudi Arabia a formal defense treaty in return for normalizing the relation with Israel and just vowing to distance itself from China and prohibit Chinese bases in Saudi Arabia. Why would Saudi Arabia need defense treaty? Right now, it seems that they're not having problem with Iran. China and Russia tried to cut a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Don't you think that they're doing the same failed policy that they have been doing in Africa?
Well, the Saudis are going to take whatever they can get. What the Saudis ultimately want is sufficient nuclear technology to make a breakout in a bomb. That's what they want. I don't think Mohammed bin Salman's contract with Islamabad, which probably calls for, and I think he paid about $20 billion for this, it probably calls for 30 nuclear weapons to be on loan, if you will, to Saudi Arabia 24 hours after Iran tests, or after Iran has conclusively, IAEA conclusively, developed a nuclear weapon. And I don't think that gives Mohammed bin Salman a warm feeling in his heart that they have to depend on Islamabad for that. I have no doubt that contract exists. So he wants his own bomb, and the way you get to it is you talk to the United States, the most vulnerable party here, because I don't think China or Russia would be stupid enough to do this, into giving you full nuclear cooperation under the guise of, as with India, but India already was a nuclear weapon state, of all being civilian, all being peaceful nuclear work. And then the Saudis break out, build their own bomb. And so when Iran has one, the Saudis have one too. And you got a balance of power, balance of terror immediately in the Persian Gulf. So that's their real reason, I think. And it should be dawning upon us that we are truly a despicable state to be the only ones that will close our eyes, as we did with Israel under Lyndon Baines Johnson, and allow the Saudis to develop a nuclear bomb. Even the Russians and the Chinese won't do that because that's a step too far for them, and I applaud them for that. So that's where we are, and I just, it's an act of desperation, Nima, an act of desperation. We are so desperate. We got this resolution in the UN now because we couldn't get Hamas or Netanyahu, that scurrilous bastard, to say that the deal was his, or Hamas that it was theirs, or better, that it was both of them's. And so now we got a UN resolution passed way late in this ball game, and it has absolutely no impact, apparently, because even though Hamas, I think, now has said, okay, we'll look at that favorably, Netanyahu's not going to look at it that way because it would mean his government fell apart. And we talk about Benny Gantz. Look at how we've done Benny Gantz. Look at it. Benny Gantz is Bibi Netanyahu with one less blood drop in his eye. You know, there's no difference. And to think that, oh, Benny's leaving, oh, everything is going to change because Netanyahu can't stand it anymore. You know, Benny's leaving. Benny is Bibi with a little more sense. That's all, and a little less blood on his hands, but not very much less. So what do we got? We got stasis. But what does Bibi love? He loves stasis. He loves killing more Palestinians. In that stasis, he can kill more and more. And now he's going to gin up a war with Hezbollah. And we're going to have a real threat to the existence of Israel. And guess who's going to have to pull him out of that? Same way we pulled him out of Lebanon in 1982-83.
The situation, if they start fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, that would be huge, because if they do that, I think they're trying to bring the United States into the conflict in that region. That's why they're trying to push it that way. And with the situation with Houthis in the Red Sea, and the situation that we had, these tensions between Iran and Israel, we haven't seen any type of direct conflict between Iran and Israel. This makes the situation even worse. And what would happen in the future can get out of the hand of the United States.
Well, I think Soleimani's plan, even though he's perished, is coming to fruition. His whole idea was, once we destroyed the balance of power in the Persian Gulf, then Iran should take its irregular forces, they're really regular forces, and they're probably the best, and go out and find proxies, develop those proxies, and kill the empire with 1,000 pricks. And that's what he's doing. The only place where it is somewhat attenuated is Iraq, and that's because they overstepped their writ in Iraq a bit. And so you've got people in Iraq, and the government in particular, who don't like what's happening with respect to Iran inside Iraq. So you got a little tension there, but almost everywhere else it's working. And it's working particularly well with the Houthis and what they're doing, and it's working particularly well with Hezbollah. But I don't think Nasrallah is in thrall of the Ayatollah the way other people say he is. You know, we misinterpret these things all the time. I think Nasrallah is very interested in his host country, Lebanon, and he knows what bad shape Lebanon is in. It's a basket case, losing population every day. And he doesn't want to make that worse, and he knows that Israel always attacks everything. They don't just attack Hezbollah. They blow up everything in Lebanon that could possibly be future success for Lebanon. They attack their economy. They attack everything. And so he doesn't want that to happen, let alone have the United States join them in that. So he's very reluctant to enter this fray. But Netanyahu wants him to enter the fray for the very reasons you just stated. He wants to deflect attention from his own terrible situation, wants to kill Palestinians while he's deflecting it, and we won't pay any attention if we're, helping him deal with Hezbollah. And that's the best thing he can do. And what he really thinks is that if we get in with Hezbollah big time, we, the United States, will finish off Iran. I got news for him. Soleimani's tactics, his strategy is working so well that the pinpricks have succeeded in making the United States incapable of taking on Iran. So then we're in real trouble, significant trouble. We're going to have to retreat from all over the world. 38,000, I think we got left in Germany. We've got probably on any given day 1.5 times that in the Middle East. We got some troops in Japan and in Korea. We're going to have to withdraw. We're going to have to retrench completely because our power is going to be so. And this is what Soleimani's strategy was. And it's working. It's working in the Middle East as well as anywhere in the world. It's working in the Pacific, too, from the point of view of what our allies like Vietnam and the Philippines, and I hesitate to call Vietnam an ally. They just don't like China. But the Philippines, Korea, Japan, they're all going to be checking their six, checking their flanks, and looking around, too, as the United States begins to retrench and withdraw. And the world's going to be a very, very different place. We will be lucky, Nima, if we can maintain our hegemony in our hemisphere. Very lucky. If I live another 10 years, God forbid I do, I'll be so old, but we will have lost our hegemony everywhere in the world except our own hemisphere. And once that happens and people see and probably learn to detest us even more, because when we can concentrate what power we have left in the Western Hemisphere, they'll learn to hate us even more. Where are we headed? I just finished reading the seminal section of that book I was telling you about by Frankopan about the Silk Roads and how these empires come and go, come and go, come and go, and come and go. And then one comes that gets really big, like Persia, or the one centered in Baghdad for a while, or the Eastern and Western Roman empires. And you watch what happens over time, and it's happening right now. It's happening right now. It's happening in modern terms, but it's happening right now. And modern terms, I think, are accelerated terms, too. They don't give you 300 years to get this woman married to this man and get the empires fused, and last another 100 years. You don't have that kind of time today. And you don't have marriages that meld empires either. I was really interested to see that the guy who was ruling in Kiev in something like, maybe 1070, 1060, somewhere around there, was actually married to, and was married to for a reason, the sister of the king whom the Normans defeated at Hastings in 1066. And she was noted as the most powerful woman in all the world at that time. Well, we're in that kind of transition period right now. We're going away, and we're doing the best we can to accelerate that process. And we're accelerating most dramatically in the Middle East, somewhat in Europe, but most dramatically in the Middle East. And that's exactly what Powell and I talked about when we said we're going to destroy the balance of power in the Middle East. And then we will have to stay there and maintain that balance. And we will get mired to our necks, and it will be terrible. We don't need to do this, and yet we went ahead and did it. Yeah. And those were stupid people too. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, Don Rumsfeld, a whole host of very stupid people who got us into this mess, and got Iraq into this mess, and got Afghanistan into a mess, and got Syria into a mess, and got Libya into a mess. I mean, where have we not messed?
Larry, just to wrap up this session, do you think that with this new offer from the United States to make a defense treaty for the Saudi Arabia, are they gonna be able to take out the Saudis' condition for Israel to accept the state of Palestine?
They got us over a barrel. They got Blinken in particular over a barrel, because Blinken is just so anxious to have someone resurrect his reputation, which is abysmal right now. I'd say of all the foreign ministers of consequence in the world, Anthony Blinken is at the bottom of the list, and that's a long, long list. So 195 of them at last count, I think. He's 195th. And that's what he wants desperately, to resurrect his reputation. This kind of deal would do that. I don't think Mohammed bin Salman is going to be kind enough to do it for him. We're going to have to recognize that the Saudis will not make any deal without us recognizing the fact that there must be, and it must be forthwith, not 20 years from now, not 10 years from now. It must be forthwith a Palestinian state.